Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Jaren Haber. I'm now a postdoc at Georgetown University, and Heather was my advisor for some long years, and we're continuing a collaboration applying text analysis or natural language processing, pick your jargon, to some sociological and organizational behavior literature. And our big goal here is a pretty simple question, like how can we use computers to conduct literature reviews? And we're going to argue for a couple methods and give kind of a proof of concept how that can work and show some preliminary results. So that's basically the agenda. And at the end, I'm going to ask you for suggestions. So please keep your thoughts with you. I think you can ask questions throughout using the Q&A tool. Is that true, Adam? Sounds like it. Okay, good. So feel free, and we'll just get to those throughout, and especially at the end. And you might, you'll hear from Heather and Yoon probably pop in during the presentation. We haven't coordinated that, but that's probably going to happen. And certainly they're here to help with Q&A.
In fact, the chat is there available. So if you just put for those who want to sign up, they can just write their name or in the kind of stack in the chat.
Awesome. Okay, so just, there you go. Write your name in the stack and we'll get to you later. All right, so jumping in here. First, I'm going to make a case for computational literature review, which is a computational form of something very old. To make a meaningful contribution to a literature, you need to know the literature, which means reading a lot of stuff. And yeah, the issue is that it's very hard to read a lot of stuff these days because the number of journals has exploded since the 1700s. There's a long time scale right there, but you get the point. And this is on a exponential scale, so it's massive. And you see the same thing when you look at the number of articles, a logarithmic increase leading all the way up to 2007. So the point is, as far as I know, there's no Max Weber anymore. I don't know anyone or ever even heard of anyone that's read everything there is to read. There's just too much to read. So how can we use computers to help us kind of work our way through this world and know the literature enough to make a meaningful contribution? So the basic idea here is computers read things faster than we do and can cover more text and arguably more superficially, but it needs to be a targeted task. So we need to think about like how we're going to design this sort of question. So in particular, we're focused on academic literature here. So yeah, oh yes, but an important aspect of this is that the computer on its own has a pretty limited cognitive capacity, very, very fast, but as far as depth of understanding, you can argue about transformers, but there's still a lot of ground to cover before they approach anything like a human level understanding. So we need kind of a human in the loop sort of approach here. That's what we're going for, a dialogue where we supplement one with the other, human understanding with computational speed. Right, so our particular case here is an online database of articles, and we look especially at JSTOR because it's free, it's huge, and almost, I mean, every academic I know has used it, continues to use it. They have also some nice tools for doing speedy literature reviews. And we're hoping to offer one more and make it especially nice for social scientists that have a computational interest or bent. All right, so anytime you're asking a computer to do something, you need to be kind of specific about the frame of that. And for what we're doing, we're providing some kind of organizational theory building block. So we're asking the computer to look for three separate things, perspectives or dictionaries or systems of concepts. And these are the demographic, the relational, and the cultural perspectives or theoretical frameworks or paradigms. Demographic being really focused on the distribution of organizations, on social dimensions and position, relational focusing mostly on relationships, and how that defines patterns of action and opportunity, and culture focused more on the system of understandings and how that shapes how people think about the world, their cognition, and thereby constraining action. So all three different models of looking at the world, pretty broad. You know, I'm in sociology, so like the kind of parallel to this is like conflict theory or social structural theory, like massive, like large level paradigms. To simplify this a little bit, demography, the demographic perspective is focused on social and physical space. Think about size or location, differences in strategy and size throughout an industry. Relational, again, just connections. Think about buyer-supplier ties, corporate board interlocks. and cultural focus on norms, values, and how they result in people's thinking and sense of what's possible. Think of organizational innovations as it's a great idea or a terrible one, or is it something that's even in their field of awareness, or organizational cultures, which is, there's a huge and growing literature on that. Right, okay, so that's just a very broad level theoretical overview. Let's talk about methods. So the first thing we gotta do is get data, and JSTOR made this relatively easy. If you are have a university affiliation, I think probably most of the people here do, you can find these slides, click on this link, or just Google it and get a whole bunch of text like we did. And this is just an overview of the workflow. I'll go into each piece a little bit more. The next thing we did was create some dictionaries, and this may have been kind of concurrent, but for each perspective, going through some foundational texts, using expert knowledge, and developing a core set of terms, particular words or phrases that connote that perspective, have that sort of specific meaning, and is distinguishable from the other perspectives. And using this, with dictionaries in hand, we created some scores of engagement, which is our core theoretical construct or measure, which I'll get to in a second, using in two ways. And from this, we compare the perspectives, the measures, and the two disciplines we're studying, sociology and management organizational behavior. Maybe I should have mentioned that earlier, but now you know, looking at those over time. And there's probably more coming down the road, but this is pattern detection, so still work in progress. So JSTOR, we've got 70,000 articles or so at the end of the day. Originally, we got about 400,000, and then we did some filtering. We want full articles only. And this is, we're talking all academic articles published in the last 45 years, 1970 to 2015. And the level of pre-processing is pretty simple. We just, we copied JSTOR, and all they did was lowercase everything and remove stop words and punctuation. There's some details in there, but that's the big picture. Yeah, so filtered it down, kept only full English language articles, no book reviews, no notes or short articles, and nothing not in English. So that's why you're cutting off, 330,000 articles there. We're just interested in sociology and management OB, not these other related disciplines, and not non-English, etc. Okay, right, here's some examples of dictionaries. So yeah, dictionary is a pretty old term in terms of computational social science. It's just a list of terms that relate to some central concept or theme. In our case, demographic, relational, and cultural. And this sort of data product is really useful for our study because we're talking about a specialized vocabulary or jargon related to these literatures, these subject areas. Just some examples here: demographic, imprinting or inertia, relational, resource dependence, vertical integration, cultural, decoupling or ceremonial evaluation. If you know about organizational theory, these will be familiar to you, but just a couple of kind of concrete examples for what we, the building blocks for our dictionaries. And yeah, based on Heather's close reading, she's the expert knowledge in the game, going through some foundational articles, looking at, originally she got something like 150 terms per perspective, and then did some close reading to look at which ones are really distinctive for each perspective and not universal. So terms like organizations or institutions arguably is cultural, but trying to get just the most kind of succinct and distinguishing terms. Heather, do you want to add anything to that?
Nope, that's pretty good. Basically trying to just find an equal length dictionary across all three perspectives with the terms that are most central to those perspectives.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so then, yeah, so using the dictionaries, basically we counted terms, but we also used another measure here. So let me break it down a little bit. The basic construct that we're trying to measure is engagement. So basically how prevalent is each perspective in a given discipline at a given year. And to measure that, we just took each article's engagement with each perspective and averaged it. So that's what you see in the formula there. And as far as how we measure engagement PSAT, what you see there, each article's level of engagement, we used two methods. One was word count based using the n-grams provided by JSTOR, and simply counted up all of the times any given word from a given perspective in a given article occurred, and divided by the length of the article, the total number of, total number of words, terms. Right, and remember stop words are removed, so you've got a pretty clean signal. And the other way we did this was with word vectors, namely word2vec. So we constructed a custom word embedding model using word2vec, using just our text data, and then use that to vectorize each dictionary. So we've got sort of a vector representing cultural, relational, or demographic. And then we took the angle between each of those dictionary vectors, and then the vector representing every article. And then, yeah, and then we averaged those in the same way. So each article was turned into a bunch of word vectors, find the centroid or the average among them, and then you find the angle between that and the dictionary or perspective vector. That's probably a little high level and maybe lost on you if word vectors are totally new, but that's the method. And don't need to worry too much about how word2vec works. That's just a little bit of the weeds for you. All right, now we've got a bunch of results, and I'm gonna ask for your help kind of in making sense of them, but let me review what we found so far. So if you're taking the demographic perspective in sociology, this is what you see. Oh, and this is the ratio measure. So a lot of moving parts here, but here you see the changes over time and the level of engagement with the demographic perspective. And the middle line is the median, the top line is the 75th percentile, and the bottom line is the 25th. So this is kind of gives you a sense of the range. So we're not just talking about sort of central tendency, also a bit of deviation here as well. Yeah, and it does matter to some extent that the top line is more distant from the median. It suggests there might be some top level outliers, but that's a question for later. I mean, the basic result here you see is it's pretty rocky, but it's consistent. So looking at this this middle line here, does go up and down a fair bit, and we probably could trace this to particular articles that make it move up or down, waves of popularity that are small, but basically there's not a lot to see. And the top line is even more jagged. So, and then if we look at the cosine measure, it's pretty much the same. So great. I mean, arguably we validated the lack of results for this perspective with this discipline. What happens when we look at demographic with management and OB? You see kind of a broad tendency of growth here. Definitely some rockiness still. So there's some question, but it's, I mean, compared to the previous results, it's pretty apparent. And when you look at the cosine measure, it's even more rocky, but it's still, I mean, even more obvious. And there's this interesting jump in early 2000s. Like, what is that? First closer inspection. Okay, next perspective here, looking at relational. Yeah, it's a little hard to see, but if you just look at the scale on the y-axis there, it goes up to 0.1. And I'm just going to jump back for a second here. This one goes up to 0.9 and 0.5. So don't mean to disorient you, but the point is that relational is on a different scale. And it's hard to see because of the way the graphs are scaled, but that's just a broad tendency I'm just pointing out to you. Again, rocky but consistent. Who knows what's going on there? Looking at the cosine measure, it's pretty much the same. Whereas you look at management OB, again, comparing to sociology, it looks like there's a growth in the use of this perspective over time. And it's even more so, again, with that bump in the early 2000s for the relational perspective. And last one, cultural perspective. Yeah, there's a kind of a drop off in 2000 for some reason. And that's the ratio measure. Look at the cosine measure. I mean, there's kind of some increases there, but mostly consistent. And last pairing here, cultural and management, organizational behavior. There's this strange valley around 2000. And yes, we have not explained this, but it's interesting to think about as far as the movement of theory and popularity among scholars, how people are, what lenses through which people are seeing the world. And look at the cosine measure, and it actually looks a little different. There's kind of a pretty clear hill there that's climbing. So this is the one with the biggest difference, I would say, when you look at the ratio with this pairing, cultural and management OB, and look at cosine, it's actually a very different story. The others are really consistent. All right, so what are our broad results here? Mostly we're talking about rocky consistency again, whatever you make of that. But top level relational is the most common. Again, back to my comment on the scaling of the y-axis there. And that's true for both disciplines. But there were some differences. So pardon the weeds here, but it looks like management and OB has a higher level of engagement with the perspectives, and it increases over time. So remember the upward trend for management and OB, especially with the cosine measure, whereas we weren't really seeing that for sociology, except maybe a little bit with cultural perspective. So, I mean, the question that comes out of this is management OB a more like faddish discipline? Are they paying attention to, you know, managerial thinking, what's hot and what's not, more so than our sociologists? I would kind of think so, because business schools are a very different animal than sociology departments, but we could argue probably. So anyway, that's a question that emerges from this. And then I've got some ideas for how to improve our approach, and I'd love your feedback on this. We could refine the embeddings approach by expanding the dictionaries, and we've actually tried this. We've expanded them from 36 to 100 terms, and the results are pretty much the same. Another idea is to train separate word embedding models for different time windows or different subjects, because we just got one model built on the 70,000. You know, now I'm thinking about it, we could also train a separate model on the 400,000 and use that to see if the results are different. Or do some outlier detection and removal. Maybe that's part of why there's so much noise. But it's hard to decide what the upper cutoff might be. Yoon and I were talking about having 2 standard deviations above the mean or below the mean, and just seeing what that looks like, but you might have other suggestions. And then I love this idea. I have no idea how to implement it just yet, but we could use citation data if we're thinking about how these perspectives have grown or where they're getting the most attention and traction. You might think that if some articles coming out are highly cited, it might mean the overall engagement with that perspective increases in the coming years. And if you if you've got some articles that are a broad set of citations in like a higher range of disciplines, maybe not just some narrow cadre of like organizational theorists in a couple of journals, but like a broader range, it could increase the popularity of that perspective, the uptick in engagement, same idea. And then last one, we could do something more along the lines of like specific comparisons of the theories. So rather than taking the percentage of terms, this is a little hard to explain, but so we've got, if you think about the engagement measure, you construct the text vector, the article vector, using all the terms of the article, regardless of what they're about. Or if you're constructing the ratio measure, the denominator is all the words in the article. So the proportion of all words in the article that are theoretical in a specific sense. We could make this maybe a bit sharper if we just look at the terms that come from any of the dictionaries. So it's like, amongst all theoretical language an article employs, how much of that is cultural, demographic, or relational, to sort of compare them more directly. And implementing that just means putting a vocabulary filter in there. We're not looking at all words, just theoretical ones. And we could compare how their usage together changes over time as well. And we've done this, and so far it's pretty similar. We've got a broader range of dependent variable here. Engagement has a more variation for sure. And maybe there's some slight differences in what the graphs look like, but the top line results are the same. You see some growth, some static or noisy sameness over time. Okay, so what I'd love to hear about from the audience, great, that's only been 20 minutes so far, is which of these directions you find most compelling? And how do you interpret what we've seen? There's some difference between the disciplines, there's some consistency, and we're kind of searching for a theoretical explanation here because we're still in pattern detection mode, and could have even another series of analyses coming out of this. And then, yeah, what about the differences between the ratio and cosine measures? One should be validating the other, but in some cases they're noticeably different. And then what other questions or comments do you have? So that's my pitch to you, and I'd love for everyone to chime in the chat, get on the stack, and hear from you. So that's my close. Thanks for your attention.